Hello, welcome everyone. We are delighted to have today for a fireside chat Dr. Ian Fry, who is currently the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. A very warm welcome, Dr. Ian Fry, from both Nilofer Oral and myself and the Center for International Law. Dr. Ian Fry is an international environmental law and policy expert. His focus has primarily been on mitigation policies and loss and damage associated with the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol and related instruments. Mr. Fry has worked for the Tuvalu government for over 21 years and was appointed as their ambassador for climate change and the environment between 2015 and 2019. More recently, he's been appointed by the Human Rights Council of the United Nations as the first special rapporteur on the protection and promotion of human rights in the context of climate change. This has been a recent mandate created by the Human Rights Council in resolution adopted in October 2021, and Mr. Ian Fry has been appointed almost 1 year ago, but not yet 1 year ago, in March 2022. So we are extremely privileged to have you, Ian, to chat with us in an interactive discussion on your mandate and the challenges that your mandate brings. We again thank you for being with us and making the time from your very, very busy schedule. And so we wanted to discuss what has been happening a bit since you've been appointed by the Human Rights Council. And as I said, this has been almost 1 year ago in March 2022, and we wanted to ask you what evaluation you make from the first months of your mandate.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to participate in this discussion. Yes, I've had to hit the ground running. The sort of mandate that's been given to me by the Human Rights Council is quite broad, and it's covered, basically all aspects of human rights, aspects of climate change, and you can imagine that covers quite a lot of issues. So I reported to the Human Rights Council in June of last year, and I'd only been in the position for 2 months. Sort of my thinking of where this mandate should go. And I identified some key themes, and we can talk about those later. But one of the first things I wanted to do was to go and visit Bangladesh. Bangladesh was one of the countries that sort of sponsored my mandate. So there's a sort of a small group of countries that sponsored my mandate: Bangladesh, Vietnam, the Philippines were sort of key promoters of having this position. So I wanted to see, the real impacts of climate change on a country like Bangladesh. It was my first visit there, and it was certainly, a real eye-opener for me. I've worked for the Tuvalu government, a small Pacific Island country, a coral atoll, and I certainly know how vulnerable Tuvalu is. But it's also, to see a country like Bangladesh and the vulnerabilities that it confronts is enormous. And so, the human rights challenges associated with that climate change vulnerability are certainly enormous. I reported to the UN General Assembly in October as part of my work, and I do that each year. And for the General Assembly, I mainly focused on loss and damage issues, more or less as sort of agenda items for the upcoming COP in Egypt, looking at loss and damage, so, some mitigation issues as well. But I really wanted to give a focus and sort of look at the sort of human rights element to loss and damage, to sort of make that linkage, because peoples are losing the right to life, the right to housing, to health, education as a consequence of climate change. And so and that, links very closely to the loss and damage agenda. So then I attended the COP for a week, and it was interesting. This is the first time I've attended a COP not as a negotiator. So it was a completely different world for me. In fact, it's like a parallel universe that attends COPs. You've got people who attend COPs and attend all the side events, and then you've primarily got the sort of government people who are involved in the negotiations. So I've been doing negotiations for over 20 odd years, and to go to a COP and not be involved in negotiations was a bit strange for me. But I had many sort of side events that I attended. I attended discussions with Indigenous peoples with disabilities, trade union groups. I met with the director of the United Nations Environment Programme, the special advisors of the UN Secretary General on climate change. So, there was endless sort of meetings that I normally would never have been able to attend, as a climate change negotiator. So it's a whole new agenda for me, in that sort of side of the sort of climate change COP agenda issues. Just interestingly enough, just to, as a lead up to Egypt, I received a number of complaints from human rights activists in Egypt about the treatment of human rights activists in Egypt in the lead up to the COP. And based on those concerns, I wrote a complaint letter. That's a sort of process that I can do as a special rapporteur to the Egyptian government about the treatment of human rights advocates, particularly climate change advocates, and asked that the Egyptian government allow protests to take place around the COP as had been traditionally done. And so that was an interesting exercise. And I met with the Egyptian ambassador to Geneva a couple of times, one in person and one online. And while I was at the COP, I met with the sister of a climate change or environmental rights activist who was in jail on a hunger strike. And she was very concerned about her brother's situation. And it was a very distressing time for her, to be confronted with her brother's situation. And so this was, a key issue that I could bring to the attention of the COP and participants at the COP, and also to the Egyptian government. So that's part of my work, is that I can, draw attention to these sort of critical issues. And I've written letters of complaints on a number of issues, settlers in Myanmar and Indigenous peoples concerned about the development of gas developments in Western Australia. So there are a number of issues that I've been sort of following as part of my special rapporteur position.
Thank you for that. And it's very interesting how, besides, of course, the work of preparing the reports for the Human Rights Council, there are other activities that you can have in your role as a special rapporteur. But I wanted to go back to the issue of loss and damage and to your presence at COP, because of course loss and damage was one of the big issues in the COP in Sharm el Sheikh last November, and there was of course important movement, but probably not yet enough. But I wanted to ask you, from your point of view, how do you assess the achievements on loss and damage at the mechanism at the last COP, and how are they relevant to your mandate?
Well, the whole negotiations on loss and damage, have been extremely slow. There's a lot of pushback from some key developed countries on the issue of loss and damage, and particularly, the United States is concerned about issues around liability and compensation. And so it's been a real struggle to get loss and damage as a key issue for consideration by the COP. And so to get a decision on a loss and damage fund was a significant step forward, albeit, not an agreement that we would have a fund, but to establish a process to consider a fund and establish a sort of process to think that forward. So it's only a very incremental step. And in my report to the UN General Assembly, I spoke about this loss and damage fund and suggested that the UN Secretary General establish a group of finance experts who can think outside the box to look at new sources of funding for loss and damage, because we're talking billions of dollars worth of damage that people are suffering already. We only have to think about Pakistan and the floods that occurred in Pakistan late last year, and the billions of dollars worth of damage there, to think that that the climate change process can't deliver that sort of funding. The Green Climate Fund certainly is not in the order of magnitude necessary to deal with loss and damage. So we have to find some people who can think outside the box. And I had consultations with civil society organizations, business, etc., as part of my mandate, and there are some very interesting ideas about new sources of funding. So that could be taxes on fossil fuels, aviation industry, drawdowns from the IMF, debt relief. So there's some interesting ideas out there, and I was hoping that the Secretary General might take up the idea of getting some experts who can think outside the box, because I think that's really what is needed to really bring the order of magnitude of concern on the loss and damage fund.
If I can just, I have a quick question to follow up on. And again, Ian, it's really wonderful to have you with us. And I have to say, you are one of the few people that truly have had an incredible history as a negotiator representing Tuvalu. And in the small experience I had, you really made an impact. So I think it's wonderful that you are now in this position as Special Rapporteur. But I just wanted to follow up, because on this loss and damage fund, as you know, there is also, and that was since Copenhagen, this whole promise for $100 billion a year annually by developed countries that they would to developing countries. How will this loss and damage fund be distinguished from that commitment? And I know I agree thinking outside the box, but will there be some tension there, because there seems to be already that funding isn't coming in, including for the Green Climate Fund?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think this is the issue, the 100 billion that was promised, in Copenhagen and again in Cancun, was a political deal, basically to advance, negotiations around commitments for a mitigation agreement that finally led to the Paris Agreement. And so that was a deal struck. And of course, that deal hasn't been met so far, and certainly that's a real concern. And the critical thing I think about a loss and damage fund is it just can't come from public finance. It has to come from other sources of finance, basically applying the polluter pays principle and trying to get business to put up the cash for this rather than from the public finance. So in that respect, I don't think it will compete with the other promises of public finance that are being considered, going into the Green Climate Fund. But that's not what everybody thinks, and others, want a slice of the pie of the Green Climate Fund. But I sense that's just not enough to deal with the impacts that people are suffering already as a consequence of climate change, and the costs of the impacts of climate change are only going to rise. And I suspect that climate change litigation will also drive this agenda. Where compensation claims will be starting to appear more regularly in climate change litigation, and so countries and corporations are going to have to think: are we going to face litigation, or should we be putting money voluntarily into some sort of sourcing of loss and damage fund?
So perhaps we can focus now maybe on that question of increasing domestic litigation on on the issues of climate change, and in particular also of climate change and human rights. This has clearly been something that we've been witnessing in the last decade or so, with more intensity over the last few years. And many jurisdictions have had cases where the claimants have made a case for at least the government being asked to do more with regard to fighting climate change, or even to be condemned for having violated human rights. And we see that in Europe, but also outside of Europe, and including also with the human rights treaty body committees. And there's been, a number of important developments in the area. Of course, as you just mentioned, it may have an impact on how governments think of loss and damage and the issue of compensation, but it might also help in progressing clarity, or bringing clarity to the obligations of states towards their own citizens and towards citizens of other countries in terms of extraterritorial application of human rights obligations. How is that relevant also for your mandate, and how you're looking at this increasing domestic litigation on climate change issues?
Yes, it's certainly on my radar. It's one of the sort of 6 thematic areas that I'm looking at as far as my mandate is concerned, and looking at this whole issue of litigation, legislation, and looking at the issue of intergenerational justice. So I'm currently working on a report for the next UN General Assembly, and I have a lawyer from Brazil who's helping me do some research on this, who's looking at various climate change legislation to see how the application of loss and damage appears in legislation, and then we'll be looking more closely at the whole litigation side, and what are the common trends around litigation, particularly around the advancement of the causal link between sources of greenhouse gas emissions and the impacts that are occurred. And that can only, develop further as litigation advances, and further jurisprudence comes out on that sort of linkage of causes. And we're starting to see now, not just governments being litigated against, but also corporations. And I think that will only develop. The particular issue I'm quite interested in is this whole issue of intergenerational justice. How we enshrine the rights of future generations into international law, into regional agreements, into national law. I mean, this is a critical thing, and it's certainly a lot of young people are coming to me and saying we need this guarantee of our future as a legal norm. And so, that's part of my work, is to explore what are the legal options, whether that's through human rights law or other forms of international law that can enshrine that concept further. I mean, the issue of intergenerational equity goes right back to the Stockholm Conference 50 years ago, but it's never developed really into international law per se, as a form of justice. So it's certainly one of the issues that I'm going to be looking at. I had a consultation with some groups from Latin America earlier today, because one of the thematic areas I'm looking at is climate change displacement, and as a sort of subset really of loss and damage. And this is a critical issue of international law that is problematic. For most cases, people displaced across international borders are not defined as refugees under the Refugee Convention. There could be some exceptions to that, but there is some advancement there, particularly in Latin America. There's a sort of Cartagena Declaration which expands the definition of refugee to cover public disorder. And so there are views that could be used as a trigger mechanism to give rights to people as refugees. But I'm still looking at this issue. I think perhaps there needs to be further development of international law to give proper protection to people that cross international borders as a consequence of climate change. So that, and what we heard from, and there were lawyers there, that they need the sort of the jurisprudence coming out of the courts to make those determinations. And the trouble is that the judiciary and lawyers are not well versed in the issue of climate change and climate change displacement. So there's a lot of educational work that's required to advance that. And so that's, again, how I'll be looking at those sorts of issues of how to advance, educational work for the judiciary and for lawyers around this issue of climate change displacement.
Can you maybe, I'm interested in this last point, in terms of training for domestic judges and lawyers. Can you expand a bit on how within your mandate you could promote that, or does it have to be through other means?
I don't think I can do it myself, but I can contribute to it and encourage institutions like your own to be involved in that sort of work. I was involved earlier on in the year, last year, with a regional workshop organised by UNEP, Asia Pacific, IUCN, that brought together judges from the Pacific to understand climate change litigation, and so they asked me to speak at that. I don't pretend to be, knowledgeable on that sort of issue, but it was at least able to sort of make that connection between the sort of climate change impacts issue and human rights obligations under international law. So I'd be encouraging, institutions like your own to explore that further, to how to develop, educational materials for the judiciary around those issues.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting proposal, something that we should definitely look into, because I know the IUCN UNEP is about training for judges in the environmental law. But here specifically, you're saying about protection of persons and climate change. So I think, Patricia, particularly since that's also work you're doing, that might be definitely something that we can look into as well. It's a very good suggestion. We had recently here Justice Brian Preston from Australia. I'm sure you know him. And he gave a very good lecture on the climate change litigation. I know he's been very active on these issues as well. Anyway, over to you, Patricia, but I just wanted to react immediately to the suggestion by Ian.
Yes, no. It's extremely interesting also from the point of view of institutions like CIL, but this issue of identifying areas of training and exchange of experience, because I think one of the interesting issues about the litigation that is going on in different parts of the world is then people that were involved as lawyers or judges share their experience how it's done, because I think every case and every jurisdiction has its own specificities, and so it's it's very interesting to see how a claim was brought in a certain jurisdiction. Why was it successful? Why is it not successful? Because I think it's very different depending on the jurisdiction. And I don't know if you have that you've had that experience, but I think it's something that that certainly is emerges, that you have different dynamics, different specificities, and there's a lot of possibility for sharing those experiences.
Yeah, I think that, there are enormous opportunities for this sort of work to advance and to assist the judiciary in understanding some of these issues. What climate change is for a start, and how that can be linked to climate change and human rights issues.
And yes, just follow up.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
It's a conversation we're having, so I'll just jump in. But as you said, also for the intergenerational equity, we know, of course, famous Supreme Court decision out of Philippines, I guess from the 1990s. And it's a long time ago. And of course, Tony Opoza, who was the Opoza case. But why hasn't that moved forward more? And I think your point is a good point taken about making future generations, particularly in the context of climate change, a normative right and not an aspirational, that is, okay, we see it in preambles and all that, but really to make it a norm. So it's a good question, I think, as well we have to pose, which may lead to another question, Patricia, in terms of cases coming up.
Yeah, no, exactly. And well, that's probably one of the important aspects of this initiative that is being led by Vanuatu, of bringing a request for an advisory opinion before the International Court of Justice. One of the key questions that is put on the table is about the rights of future generations, or the obligations of states towards future generations. So that might be also an area where there can be some clarification of the law. And indeed, and we've been talking so far about domestic legislation and domestic litigation, but on the international plane, in the international level, there's been also a number of developments that I think also the creation of your mandate, the mandate of Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change, is also part of this wider development, because now we're seeing a number of initiatives like this Vanuatu initiative of an advisory of opinion before the International Court of Justice, an initiative by COSIS, the Commission on Small Island States, that Nilufer can maybe speak more to, because she's also a member of the legal team of COSIS, of asking for an advisory opinion before the International Tribunal on the law of the sea. There's been also, and that shows that Latin America is also a very active region, and you were just mentioning that you had consultations with Latin American experts, but there's a recently announced joint initiative by Colombia and Chile for an advisory opinion before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So there's a number of initiatives, and we'll come back later also to the work that we're doing in the International Law Commission. But how do you see those initiatives in synergy with your mandate, and where do you expect that there can be, strengthening cross-fertilization between these different initiatives and your own mandate?
Well, yes, there's some very interesting sort of developments on this. I have to be very honest with you. I was quite skeptical about this proposal by Vanuatu and seeking an advisory opinion on the ICJ. I followed it right from the very early times as sort of formulation of the question that was being asked. And to me, there are two issues that any good lawyer will tell you, is that you don't ask a question you don't already know the answer to, and you don't ask a question that's it's not going to help your circumstances. And I was quite skeptical about the sort of questions that were being asked, because I thought the issue is quite well established in the preamble to the Paris Agreement, and I think the ICJ can easily draw from the preamble to the Paris Agreement to indicate that. I can't see how they're going to, explore new law that will advance the issue substantially. I suspect this is more a publicity issue rather than, develop a substantive issue of the development of international law. But I stand corrected on that, and I'm just not sure. However, I think the tribunal, the law of the sea advisory opinion is a lot more focused, and I was not involved in discussions with the Tuvalu government about this at all, so I don't have to declare any conflict of interest in this. But I think that's more focused and could provide some useful guidance on that, because there are real challenges with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, around nationality, statehood, and sea level rise that needs to be advanced in that area. So I think, and you know, when I was working for the Tuvalu government, the former Prime Minister brought this up at Oceans Conference, etc., about this issue of, accepting the principle of static baselines under the law of the seas, irrespective of sea level rise. So once the baseline is established by a country under the law of the sea, that it would remain in perpetuity, irrespective of sea level rise. And this is quite a critical issue, particularly for small island states who will lose territory and therefore consequently lose substantial areas of their economic exclusion zone, which will affect their economies. So I think there's value in that one. And I also think there's value in the Chile-Colombia issue of, seeking an advisory opinion. My feeling is, however, a lot of these are more academic exercises than real advancement of these issues. If countries were genuine about these, they wouldn't be seeking an advisory opinion, they'd be seeking a dispute. And I think there are grounds for disputes under ITLOS, loss of territory under ITLOS, for a country to seek a dispute under the Tribunal on the Law of the Sea and, under these human rights treaties. So this is more of a fishing exercise. I'd like to see, real cases that come forward as disputes that, bring decisions and may get decisions of reparations as a consequence, rather than just seeking an opinion. So that's, I guess, where I stand on this issue. I've been in discussions with the Special Rapporteur on the right to the clean, healthy and sustainable environment and the Special Rapporteur on toxic chemicals, and it's likely we'll work together to seek leave of the courts under ITLOS and under this case in Colombia, Chile, to prepare an amicus brief for both those cases, to provide support to those cases. So I'm meeting with them online very soon to discuss that possibility.
And I just want to follow up very quickly. I think, you said a lot of things, and Patricia may have also some other points to raise, but just to hook on to the issue of, rather than advisory opinions that may be academic, political, to bring an actual dispute. I agree, because the Law of the Sea Convention has Part 15. I think that there are opportunities, but the reality too is that for some of these small island developing states to bring a case, and let's put causation aside, that's always raised, but politics. And I think you probably know very well that, back when the initial idea was floated for an advisory opinion, I think it was Palau, that there was a lot of pressure placed. So is this perhaps a way that, at least can get that profile raised? Could it lead to an actual case? I don't know. But these are just some thoughts I have, and what your experience has been in the real world of politics behind the scenes.
Yes, and if you look at some of the cases of the ICJ where they've sought opinions of the courts, it's a challenge for small countries to take on these bigger countries. We only have to look at the Maldives case, and others around these issues. There's a lot of pressure put on small countries to not make these cases, but hopefully these issues will advance, and small countries will stand up and go to these courts for these cases, because it's critical that the survival of some of these countries is important, and we need to make sure that they're properly protected under international law.
I think there can also be a good case made for the usefulness of these initiatives in terms of advisory opinions, as seeking for the clarification of of the international law as it stands today. I think that's the main goal, and that's something that I think it's welcomed. I agree that maybe sometimes we'll not get the results that we hope for, but I think the reason behind these different initiatives, and I think it's also something that certainly is also something that you're looking for in your mandate, and also from our side, both Nilofer and myself, in the International Law Commission, where we are dealing with the issue of sea level rise, so one specific aspect of climate change, and in relation to international law, and we're looking at law of the sea issues, statehood, and of course also protection of persons. I think all these different exercises, initiatives are an effort for the clarification of the law in abstract, so outside of disputes, of bilateral disputes, regional disputes, where and coming back to the point that you made, Ian, in your initial remarks, and that Nilofer just also mentioned, I mean, the issue of causation legally is a very tough one. So it's interesting to see how that will develop also in domestic litigation. But when you look at the international level, I think that's it's still very difficult, I think, legally to determine, and that's clearly why, also from the point of view of the International Law Commission, we've decided not to deal with that. But so I wanted to hear a bit about your thoughts about this. The effort of clarification of the law, the difficulty of establishing causation, and in that aspect, the value of advisory opinions versus the dispute settlement per se.
Yes, the issue of causation, has been for a long time the biggest hurdle around these climate change litigation. Back in 2002, I was approached by a lawyer from the United States, or the Tuvalu government was, who wanted to run a tort in the United States against an American company for damages to Tuvalu, and that's way back in 2002. And at the time, I advised the government that the advancement of the concept of causation hadn't been advanced well enough in law to be worthy of seeking a case under tort law. However, I think we've seen slow progress in that. I think the gender case is quite helpful in advancing the causation argument. I think some of the decisions made by Justice Preston have advanced the issue of connecting the sources of emissions and the damage that's causing. So I think we are making that progress around the concept of causation, and I think I think using the science as well, that the IPCC reports are coming out, I think that there's reasonable grounds to show causation is a factor. It's a issue of apportioning responsibility is still a critical issue that needs further consideration. But I think the causation issue has advanced a lot further than when I first looked at it in 2002.
Nilofer, you want to step in on this?
Yeah, and also I should say that we have our audience, and we welcome written questions as well. So please feel free to write in your questions, and I'm sure Dr. Ian Fry will be happy to respond to them. Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, there's so much going on now in terms of international law and climate change, from these advisory opinions. I don't know if we've ever had so many parallel advisory opinion requests, actually. So it's quite remarkable. And I think, on the one hand, I tend to be a bit optimistic and think, well, that speaks well that there is some faith in international law. So that's the good part. Having said that, Patricia and I, of course, are also members of the International Law Commission. And I do know that Tuvalu and other small island developing states at the Ocean Conference, I remember that very vividly, really wanted the commission to take on the topic, and we did. So I won't ask you if you're happy with us, but I think it's, why was it important for small island developing states in particular to have the commission take this on? And how do you see the commission's work really being part of this big picture of, I would say, international lawmaking, law changing in certain ways to fit what is really an existential challenge? I mean, that's the reality.
Well, the critical issue, for a small country like Tuvalu, particularly a coral atoll country, was that the law of the sea didn't consider climate change when it was developed. And so we needed a process to consider what are the impacts of delineation of boundaries as a consequence of sea level rise, and to advance that issue, as customary international law. I mean, knowing how difficult it is to amend the law of the sea, the thinking was, well, let's see what other institutions may be able to come up with opinions that may advance customary international law. And clearly the International Law Commission was, seen as one of those institutions that are able to bring these issues at a high level, to the UN General Assembly, as a way of advancing the concept of customary international law without going down the path of trying to amend the Law of the Sea Convention, knowing all the difficulties that arise from that. So that I think was the intent, and we're extremely grateful that ILC have taken on this issue. And this is a major part of your thematic work this year, I understand. So expect to hear from me, I guess, on that issue. In fact, I've been invited to a conference in Fiji looking at sort of statehood and nationality around those issues. So yes, I'll certainly be taking a keen interest in that issue and what the work you're doing on that issue.
Well, I think we'll be meeting in Fiji then. Patricia and I are also planning on being there, so that's great. Finally.
So instead of us sitting next door to each other at climate change meetings,
yeah, that's right.
we'll be able to.
I tell you, it is a small world and how things change, but we coalesce on these issues, working on the same issues, and meeting in Fiji next time, hopefully in Singapore as well.
Yes. Yes, I was there a few years back, and at the law school giving a talk. So I look forward to coming back at some stage.
Excellent. Patricia?
No, I wanted to go back to the. Of course, I mean, there's so many initiatives, and I think they've been generating important synergies, and I think we're all striving for this clarification of the law. One of the questions is what's going to be the end game? What's going to be the result? And in particular, when I think about the protection of persons part, which is the one that I'm dealing in the commission, and of course, special focus for you as a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. I remember that back some years ago, Tuvalu, and I'm not sure if you were involved in that, had proposed a General Assembly resolution on the issue of protection of persons affected by sea level rise. Would you see that as a desirable outcome to have a UN General Assembly resolution clarifying the legal regime of the protection of persons in case of sea level rise?
Yes, thank you. It is a small world. I was certainly involved in working with the Prime Minister of Tuvalu on that proposal for a resolution on that issue. I mean, it was it's been a long issue of concern for Tuvalu, particularly around the issue of protection of persons displaced by climate change. And to advance that issue in international law. And so going back to that early resolution, it's certainly something that I'm revisiting as part of my mandate to see whether there is a need for or advancement of international law in this issue of protection of persons, particularly around sea level rise and people displaced by climate change. I'm personally not concerned about the loss of nationality. I think, you know, we have the means to protect all countries from, you know, disappearing. We have the physical means to do that. We only have to see what the Chinese have done in South China Sea to see, you know, the major land reclamation work that the Maldives is doing at the moment. That I honestly don't think the loss of statehood is you know, a major concern. That we still have the potential to meet the requirements of a nation under the law of the sea, you know, and provide the necessary engineering works to ensure that that stays that way. But we certainly have to give, you know, there will certainly be people who will be displaced as a consequence of climate change, not only in small island states, but, you know, as I heard from Latin America, you know, there's a very large number of people who are being displaced across international borders as a consequence of climate change. And as I heard today, when these NGOs interview these people, they're reluctant to say that they're climate change refugees or whatever you want to say, because there's no legal protection for them for that. So they make up stories or suggest stories that they were victims of gangs or other illegal processes. So they trigger the definition of a refugee because they've suffered from persecution. Whereas, you know, there isn't an adequate definition for people displaced by climate change. The only, you know, and I've seen some legal arguments to say that major polluting countries who have people displaced as a consequence of climate change across international borders could trigger the definition of persecution because of their lack of action to address climate change. But that would be only a small number of people. The countries that are the most affected are the ones who are generally the least producer of greenhouse gases. And therefore, you know, we have to find a legal remedy for those people. And that's either, you know, a redefinition of refugee under the Refugee Convention, which a lot of people are not, you know, all that convinced with. Though, you know, the Cartagena Declaration in Latin America, you know, opens up that definition a little broader to you know, cover disturbance of public order, and that can be useful to you know, be defined as an event of disturbance of public order, could be defined as a climate change event, or even, you know, slow onset events as well. But I'm still looking at this issue, and I'm, you know, receiving comments from a lot of people around that issue. But I think there are opportunities, and I seriously think we do have to develop new international law to give protection to people displaced by climate change.
Yeah, to be continued. But maybe I want to just come back to the beginning and ask a bit more about the priority areas that you've identified for your mandate and what's coming next. What should we be attentive to, you know, in terms of your reports and the priority areas that you focused in your first report?
Yes, thank you. So my position lasts for 3 years, and I have to do 2 reports a year to the Human Rights Council and 1 to the UN General Assembly. So I've created, you know, come up with sort of 6 thematic areas that I'll be working on, you know, for these reports. So the first one, as I explained, was primarily around loss and damage. The second one, I'll be reporting to the Human Rights Council in June of this year around this issue of climate change displacement. So I've got to come up with some ideas pretty quickly. The third issue, you know, is around the issues that we've just been discussing, you know, climate change legislation, litigation, and intergenerational justice. So that'll be a report to Human Rights Council next year. The fourth issue is I'm looking at is corporate accountability. So this is looking at disclosure mechanisms and you know, and looking at measures to you know, and enshrine corporate accountability under sort of disclosure mechanisms. And certainly there have been advancements recently in the United States on this issue and in Europe on some of these disclosure mechanisms. And I want to explore that further. The fifth issue is just transition. So this is dealing with people who are transitioning out of the fossil fuel industry into these new renewable technologies and looking at, how we protect their rights as well. So, and this is an interesting area to look at. And so I'll be looking at the sort of human rights aspects of just transition. And the final issue that I've been looking at is what comes under the broad umbrella of new technologies. So these are sort of what could be called the overshoot technology. So these are the, geoengineering technologies that may be deployed because we've overshot the 1.5 degrees Celsius. These are, things like cloud brightening and other geoengineering measures, and looking at the human rights implications of those. And so, yeah, that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at already sort of exploring some of these issues. I've been, in some dialogues around those issues, but they're the sort of key thematic issues that I'll be dealing with. That I could be doing a lot more, but of course there's a lot to cover in this issue and all these issues, and so doing justice to each one of them is a real challenge.
Yeah, that sounds like a very packed agenda, but all of those are critical issues. So I have to say, I think we're all looking forward to your reports and engaging continuously with you. Patricia, I see we have questions growing here in our Q&A, and I have to say one of them is something that I was thinking of asking. Shall we go ahead and ask some of those questions? Do you want me to read it out?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
So the one has to do with, it's from Kevin Setiadi. And he's saying the developed states have various pledges during climate negotiation, which of course, including COP27. Nevertheless, it's only a pledge. So what do you think needs to be done so that developed countries will implement their pledge if advisory opinions won't have a big impact? That's question number one.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that question. The challenges around, forcing obligations on countries to take action. And, as we saw with the Kyoto Protocol, countries, as we advanced obligations under the Kyoto Protocol and the second commitment period, countries pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol. So this is the real challenge of international law, is how do you create obligations without countries stepping away from them and treading that fine line. And I was involved in the negotiations of Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. And we were in a contact group and around nationally determined contributions. And the word we were negotiating was prepare, implement, and fulfill nationally determined contributions. And the United States said, our lawyers tell us we cannot live with the word implement. So, and this is the challenge we're faced with, is that, and particularly at the time of the Obama regime, is that President Obama didn't have a majority in Congress. And so he could only deliver commitments that he could do under his presidential powers, because if it went beyond that, he'd have to take the Paris Agreement to Congress and they wouldn't agree with it. So, obligatory language that should have been in the Paris Agreement disappeared as a consequence. And this is these are the sort of, political realities we have to live with, of trying to tread the line of creating obligations under international law without countries withdrawing from those obligations altogether and not being party to them. So that's the challenge. And so, I'm not sure whether an advisory opinion can force, a greater obligation on countries. They can only draw on existing law and what's there, and read what's there, and provide guidance on that. So I'm not sure what an advisory opinion will do to advance obligations by developed countries to do more. I mean, climate change is obviously a very political issue, and it's a challenge. And as we've seen in the selection of the country and the president of the COP for the next COP, who's head of an oil company. So, these are the challenges we have to face.
So we're going through the questions. There's one more question. Well, there's a couple more, but one question from David Gaukroger on the investment treaties and climate change.
Yeah.
It's a long question, but I'll try to, summarize it. So, I mean, there's been some developments in terms of how to link the climate policies in investment treaties, including at the level of the OECD. And the latest OECD Investment Treaty Conference has considered the question of how to align investment treaties with the Paris Agreement and net zero, and this will come back to the conference next year. So the issue in terms of, I think, human rights would be that investment treaties continue to promote and protect new long-term investment in coal, other fossil fuels, and other high-carbon investments. There's been a first human rights claim at the European Court of Human Rights based on the impacts of an investment treaty. As your work to date consider, or do you expect to address the interaction of investment treaties and climate change? That's the question.
Yes, there's a lot in that as well. I mean, one of the issues that I brought up in my report to the UN General Assembly was the Energy Charter Treaty, which basically locks in energy contracts and allows fossil fuel producers to litigate against countries that take action to reduce their emissions. And we've seen cases along those lines. In fact, I think Mozambique faced a huge payout cost for taking action to reduce its emissions, and was challenged under the Energy Charter Treaty. And so one of the recommendations I made to the General Assembly was to abandon the Energy Charter Treaty. And certainly France have said they've withdrawn from it. I think Denmark has withdrawn from the Energy Charter Treaty. I mean, it's had its day. Of course, the challenge now is the Ukraine war, and guaranteeing energy supplies has created a further complication in the whole climate change agenda. And what we've seen, and I've heard testimonies from countries around the world, that the old coal mines are being reinvigorated to meet the demands from Europe to meet their energy needs, as a consequence of the Ukraine war. So there are sort of whole new challenges there. Certainly I think that there is progress to be made on some of these issues. OECD is primarily developed countries, and so we have to be a bit cautious about whether they impose sanctions on other countries that are not fair, and that has to be considered in that context as well. I'm not sure whether I properly answered that question, but it's something I'll certainly be looking into.
Yeah, I just want to follow up, because I have to say that these investment treaties, I think for some of us, at least, particularly in the environmental and climate change, we're a little bit under the radar. And as I learn more, it's quite shocking. There's a big case now against the Netherlands where they're seeking $1.4 billion in damages. Italy was awarded, I don't know, $100 million in future profit damages. So these are all major impediments to really implementing Paris Agreement. And of course, what we're really worried about are the consequences It's not just the treaty itself, it's what it means to reach that temperature target. So I think your work on this would be really valuable.
Yeah, and this is the thing, you know, we're seeing these huge payouts to these companies, you know, in the order of magnitude that we're trying to get on loss and damage. You know, it's just crazy, you know, that you know, this money could be spent on loss and damage rather than paying out companies that are already making large sums of money.
I think we have to have another session.
Yeah, I was going to say the same, because we're on the hour, on the clock, and the 60 minutes of our fireside chat have you know, gone by very quickly, and I have the feeling that we've only scratched the surface, and there were a few more questions on the Q&A box that we'll leave for another moment. And also, I mean, it would be very interesting to have you back at some point to hear about the topics that you've outlined in terms of your mandate. So I'm sure this is to be continued in different forums. Our conversation also as co-chairs of the ILC study group on sea level rise and in relation to international law, and your own mandate will continue that also in other forums, but also to hear you on updating us on the progress of your work. And we've seen, you know, the areas that we've touched in terms, you know, loss and damage causation, the issue of investment treaties, which is really an area that, as Nilofer said, is sometimes under the radar. But there's important movement now with regard to the energy charters, as you've just mentioned. You know, the issue of refugees. There were some questions now related in the Q&A related to, you know, the complex question of the legal status of persons displaced by climate change. So it does touch on so many different areas of international law, and of course climate change and human rights regime. So happy that we had you, Ian. Thank you so much again for engaging with us in this interactive chat, and thanks so much for our participants also with their interest in their questions, and hope to see you sometime soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I really enjoyed the discussion. It just helps me think through some of these issues, and I'm more than happy to come back again and have that sort of discussion to, you know, to have these sorts of chats, you know, and really, you know, think through these crucial issues. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Then we take that as a date. Wonderful.
Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of the day for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.